Okay, Jonathan, we're starting with you, and let me ask some questions to start with.
Just can I have a minute just to make sure people know what the pictures are, okay?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, they're
We
labeled.
handed out pictures to all of you.
They're
Take a
labeled.
look.
I had some slides scanned from my huge slide collection, just because I felt that most of the people here would never have seen newspaper systems, and so it's hard to visualize something you've never seen. So this is a quick sort of run through what we were talking about yesterday. First picture is the newsroom at Newsday, which I believe was ATEX's first major newspaper installation.
Yep.
And you can see the sort of working environment you're dealing with here. As Richard had said, those boxes with the CRT tubes, that's all they've got in it, because all the electronics are back in the computer. Next picture is the connections for each of the terminals. It's a patch panel type connection, so you can, if something goes down, you patch them into another frame in the rack. Next picture is screen. This happens to be showing a news budget rather than a story. I put this up to you showing that you're not just a writing tool, and being a good writing tool is really, really important, and an editing tool, but you're also a management tool for doing these things. Notice that this is monospace type, but you have light and bold, you've got reverse, non-reverse, underline, non-underline. So you end up with 8 different permutations you can show on the screen, and you can show differentiation that way. You can show headlines different from body copy and so forth. You don't see the topography, but at least you see that you've got the right, the right kind of material. Next picture is, we're out of sequence here. Okay, this is a CAMX system, if this one with the round stuff on it. Okay, yeah, a CAMX system here. You've got a display ad showing outlines for graphics and the text. This is all done with vectors. This was from pretty early in the 70s. So that's, and you can see in the next picture.
CAMX was a company?
What? CAMX. Yes. Okay. A company out of Boston that was one of the companies that did display ads. So, okay, these are all proprietary systems. Here you can see the screen they were working with doing page layout, and you can see this, the typical thing where you create boxes for things and then you fill things in the boxes. So text composed on a system like ATEX would be composed broken into lines for the requisite number of lines for that story. There would be a news hole that may flow to multiple pages, and it gets linked where you flow that story into that news hole. Now, next thing is, since the CAMX system worked from, you started with a mock-up of a display ad system first, and someone would have given you a sort of mock-up of the ad graphically where it's supposed to go. You digitize that. You'd use a mouse-type digitizer with crosshairs on it to pick out the coordinates for the different elements on the ad so you could reproduce what the customer wanted on the ad. And since you had that, the user interface was all based upon that, so you end up with this enormous menu of commands that you would do by picking from the menu, which looks intimidating, but when you saw people work on it, they actually got pretty proficient. They sort of knew geographically where things were. Next picture is a Raytheon Raycomp display ad system. Works somewhat differently, different screen. This was a raster screen. You can see text elements on the left-hand side, and the text elements are placed on the page on the right-hand side. Raytheon used a bunch of, because they were not, the user interface was different, they had a lot of very specific buttons on a large keyboard for specific commands. Next picture is a company from England called Zenitron. Made a less expensive system, and this, I didn't show you the whole system, but just happens to be, a UK ad. This was a grocery store ad being composed on the Zenitron system. This was probably late 70s. Next picture is Hastech, which was also in the same business. They had their system, because they had a text system as well, they had, you see a text screen on the left and the page layout on the right. Again, you're seeing the columns, the boxes, where things are supposed to go. And then you see, the next one, you can see things flowed into that. Now, you don't have enough resolution here to be true WYSIWYG, but you do get a graphic sense of what the page is going to look like. This is on to ATEX, which Paul can talk about also. This is page layout on the ATEX terminal. And here is copy flowed into the terminal. You can see a text terminal on your right and the graphic terminal on your left.
The guy on the right is a young version of myself.
I picked this specially, Paul. So, anyway, the other ones which are relevant for later, we really haven't talked about this, but I've got several pictures here from the second generation of the Cytex color system in the 1980s. And I have these up really to show you where the sort of all the development work that led to what you need to do for doing images on a computer came from. Again, like other stuff, it started at high-end systems and then came down to the desktop, and the image portions of this, the heritage leads pretty directly to Photoshop. The thrust of what Cytex was doing was just image manipulation. They also did later, and there's a picture of that, putting images onto a page to do some very complex page type stuff as well.
Cytex was out of Tel Aviv, Israel.
Yes,
Yeah.
we know.
We know very well.
For the record, we did. Photographs. Thank you. Kept.
Yeah, these are all scanned from slides. Yeah.
This is amazing.
Okay.
Jonathan, okay, I'm curious about the color halftone on his first pic, the printed version of it, because I didn't know of any good way to get such output on paper. Is that on paper? Is that on some kind of film or something like that? I think I was at Adobe at 1989 or something like this, and we had this meeting where all the graphic designers came, and Kodak had just shown its, the first time I'd ever seen a printer that would make a halftone look like good quality. We could see the stuff. We could see all the line graphic, all the line art and everything working fine on paper, but it wasn't until the 90s that I would ever have thought of using it to print a book that would have color photographs or anything like that.
Well, these are prints from, I scanned slides and then gave them the scanned image, so this is printed from
He's
slides.
talking about this image down here.
Oh, the image down there?
Yeah.
Yes, well, okay, so,
That was probably generated, that wasn't generated directly from, that wasn't generated directly.
no, although, I mean, this is one of the issues that was a big issue in the late 80s, and Adobe was heavily involved with this, as was Cytex and Crossfield, to a lesser extent Hell, and other people involved in the high-end graphic stuff, was basically dealing with color space, was the problem of how you render the same color accurately on different devices that have different color spaces. And I can recall going to a seminar on the math behind this at Adobe and having this sort of deja vu things of having math I'd forgotten about from college suddenly become really relevant.
Yes.
Well, that's one thing that EFI addressed, was
Yes.
the color mapping.
That's right.
And
That's right.
that's because of Effie Arazi's work
So-
here
so
at
just in-
Yeah.
Cytex.
I mean, this was the most difficult issue in color was color fidelity across devices and across media. Okay? It was a really, really difficult issue.
So, yes, but just to be clear, this had been going on for years, long before anything was digital.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the experiences that will never leave my mind is we went with Evans and Sutherland, I took a tour of the R.R. Donnelley plant in Chicago that did the Sears Roebuck catalog. And it was an extensive tour where you walk through huge buildings and saw people sitting there with color negatives and color positives and retouching inks that they would retouch individual photographs by using these transparent inks. And then these were put into this gigantic gravure machine that would engrave the copper discs that would actually go into the print run. And they would run a test sample, and then guys would go in with abrasive pumice onto the gravure plates and rub them down to slightly change the color balance between the magenta, cyan, yellow, and black. And when they got all of these huge rollers that would do this, they would run the catalog. And the biggest thing, and they would take out all the color in a white shirt, for instance. They would only leave the black and you know, the manual and hundreds of people that were doing this color work, you just, all you could say to yourself is, there's got to be a better way, you know, and so that experience just left an indelible mark on my brain forever.
So I used to visit my father and grandfather in the 1940s in a photo engraving business that they were working in, and my dad was a proofer. And the proofer's job was to make sure he had the same paper that the customer was going to use, and it couldn't get too old, otherwise it wouldn't be accurate. He'd have to have the same inks that were going to be used, and he would go onto this press after they had made a copper plate and do exactly what John was describing on the 4 color plates, because there had to be separations, magenta, cyan, yellow, and black. And he would rub a pumice stone on the halftone that was engraved until he got all the colors right. And there would be somebody who was from the advertising agency that would be in the room and look at it and say, you know, that purple isn't sexy enough. I need a little more red in it. And my dad would go and basically take out the blue, but that's the way it would work.
What do you do if you rub too much?
You made a
Start it
mistake.
over.
Well, they don't, they
No.
were very careful.
With the engraving
Yeah.
place, you would make
Please.
new plates.
Use the
If you
mic,
really
Chuck.
went way too far.
And doing a test run, don't forget, was a lengthy process and an expensive process.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was 1990 when I was having a color book printed in Singapore, and I went to the and did all the color proof checking myself, and I still have samples of the cover, and it was not a combination. It was one solid color, and they had exactly this. It was a blue-green ink. But they could turn the dials, and I have 3 samples that look like 3 absolutely different colors, and without having me there to approve it, they wouldn't have known how to make the cover of the book. I had to leave Singapore after 2 weeks. They didn't finish the book in time, and so the pages of my book that I didn't have a chance to prove, so some of them came out rather badly.
It's called a press check.
Yeah, right. I mean, we're still,
I'm interrupting you. See, this is another technological discussion. And I want to get to business.
Well, it is because these things are nonlinear, and therefore it took a lot of work to get it into the software. But I wanted to make one more quick comment, and that is, we've been talking about color, but even at that time, Bob Sproul mentioned yesterday, he had the halftones done also non-digitally. We didn't use digital stuff for halftones in books until rather late in the game, I think, right?
Thank you. That's a very interesting thing. I was wondering, because the graphics and the color didn't come up as much yesterday as I expected it to. So maybe we'll have time somewhere to sneak it in. You never know. All right. Jonathan, I'm going to ask you questions.
Sure.
So you're not going to give a lecture. So we'll start with that. Each of you has a handout beside the color thing, which is these couple of pages about Sebold publications and Sebold conferences. So just, we'll be talking around that, so that's some of the detailed material. Let me start from the first. What you call Sebold publications. You started that, actually was an outgrowth of what had been done before. When did that start?
That started, what happened was I left Rocapi in 1970. My father left at the end of the year, and I came to the West Coast. He was on the East Coast, and then we started up this newsletter. Originally, it was done for what became known as the Graphic Communications Association, which was part of sort of a group under PIA, Printing Industries of America. In the first year or so, they actually, we produced it, and they actually, we wrote it, and they actually produced it and mailed it and distributed it. And then after that first year, we took over and did it ourselves, moved the production to my father's office in Media, in southern New Jersey. Yeah.
Now, how'd you finance it? Was there any issues with that, or was it just self-started?
Basically, we were making our living doing consulting. Okay? Now, bear in mind that there's a whole mindset here. When we had Rocapi, we had a company, we were competitors, but we were also evangelists. I wrote a book, I did a video, we had frequent tours through the company. All of the information that I handed out yesterday about the company and how we did things and so forth, that was available publicly in more depth than what I handed out yesterday.
You were promoting the publishing industry. Is that a fair statement?
We were, as I said yesterday morning, I had this vision of this revolution, okay? And the revolution is going to take a lot of people and a lot of collaboration. And so, from the beginning, our view, and my view especially, was that our role was to try to push things forward, okay? And that meant we did that by doing it ourselves, first of all, and that was useful because at that point, having run a development operation, having dealt with programmers and all the problems and so forth, and when I dealt with companies later on, I'd been there, I'd done that, I knew that. But the next step was to move beyond what we were doing ourselves, because now there were more and more people doing stuff. So the next step was to try to disseminate the information so that we could evaluate what's going on, we could share it with other people, and we could all learn from each other.
So stop a minute. When did any of you first hear of Sebold or Sebold publications? Let's go around. Larry, early 70s, late 70s?
Mid-70s, I'd say.
Anybody earlier? Anybody knew him early? Paul?
Early 70s.
Early 7.
Why?
I just want to.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because I was working with the publishing companies and through Xerox Education Group, and he was the source for what was going on, and we were trying to find out what technology would apply to those companies. So it was essential to be involved.
How about you, Paul?
I got involved because they were the source
Yeah.
for all this information. I had to automate the student newspaper in college, and I needed to know the information in detail in order to purchase the equipment and install it.
But the people at Xerox Park, did any of you
We all knew of Siebel.
Yeah,
And how right away, early?
Yeah.
early.
Okay,
Well,
that's interesting.
I don't remember exactly the date, but early 70s.
Wow. Okay, Jonathan, back to you. Who was the company?
Initially, just me and my father. Okay, and then he began to take on, as we grew, he began to build up the production staff in New Jersey, and then he moved it to Pennsylvania. Okay.
What do you mean your production staff? To publish the newsletter, to write the articles? What did you mean?
Initially, it was to help edit and publish, and then we began to add editorial staff as well. Okay, and then as we just kept growing, and we never marketed anything. We just did this, and it was word of mouth that spread it. So there's no marketing people or anything of that sort. It was just us writing the stuff, and then we had people who managed subscription and customer thing. We had people who did the production, which was typeset from very early on.
What did you mean by editorial?
Well, for example, we added in, trying the year, probably 74 or so, we added Steve Edwards, who was actually the son of my father's college roommate. And Steve was basically he was a copy editor is too little a word for it. Basically, he oversaw the language, the copy editing, the fitting, a lot of the selection. A selection of the news stories was done collaboratively, but basically, he made the thing be produced. Okay, and any regular publication has got people whose job it is to get the thing out the door, and that was his job.
How thick was your newsletter typically?
Typical main article ran 14, 16 pages, and then we would have new stuff in the back, so a typical issue would run 24 pages.
How often?
Twice a month.
And you kept that up for how many years?
Kept it up from 1970. Well, I stopped being involved in 1995, was still going strong, and we added more newsletters, so later on we were doing one a week, because we were doing that one twice a month, and then we were doing, from mid-70s on, we were doing at least one more. So it got to be basically one a week.
What were your sources? I'm staying with the one for the publishing area.
Well, because we had been sort of evangelists to begin with, we knew an awful lot of people. And so we just worked from there.
You're traveling to meet the people?
We traveled, we did, for example, in the 1970s, bear in mind, I never took any net salary out of Sebold Publications. I always put more money in than I got. So this was not a wildly profit-making enterprise. In the 1970s, my father and I were doing about once a month, we were doing a 2-day tutorial for people in industry. They were run in the U.S., 10 a year in the U.S. by GCA. We did them in England for a company called Pyra. I went to Australia and New Zealand in 75 and did a bunch there by myself. So we were doing things that put us out trying to teach people all the time. We were consulting for companies like U.S. News and World Report, people like that who wanted to install these systems. And we were consulting for people who were trying to design these things. The whole idea was that you, if you want to push things along, you want everybody to do the best possible job. And so you try to help everybody and give them as much information as possible.
So in the 1970s, how many of you were subscribing to the newsletter? 2 people, 3, 4? Nobody from Xerox PARC was bothering to subscribe. Why not?
Oh, we were aware of Siebel, but not, it was expensive.
I think it was in the library. I mean, you have to remember at this time, we had a pretty good library, and this was a world of weekly quasi-newspapers and newsletters. And so what I remember were Computer World and particularly electronic news. I mean, these are not research publications, but I always say that how I got interested in the computer business as different from computer research is I'd go, on the way to lunch and stop and read electronic news. And it would talk about who had won the contract for the Anyuk 27 missile control system or whatever it was. And there's like a whole different side of the library. I mean, the library had all the research publications, they had those, and then there was Ben Rosen's The Rosen Electronic Letter, what was the technologic letter that Dick Schaefer did? There were the Sebold letters. There was EMMS, Ken Buzzenworth on early electronic mail stuff. What were some others? And you sort of drop by and then as you move to the business side, you'd go, oh shit, this is more important. I really need to pay attention. And then you start to pay Gartner money and other people in the bribes and all the rest that you had to do. But there was this undercurrent of monthly or semi-monthly newsletters and other things that were coming out.
Others of you, so you weren't subscribers, how many of you were aware? What, any of you, you were, Paul? So a number of you were aware of this, of the material.
This was an interesting issue because the price, I don't recall over, it's been a lot of years, but I recall later on, I recall the pricing, that was in the 80s. The publishing system was $360 a year. And we knew that the actual circulation was more than 10 times what our actual paid circulation was, because companies typically that would take it and they would photocopy it. There was a guy in Australia who had a circulation of 1,000 of pirated copies, okay, which we never could turn him off. So we knew that was happening, but we also knew, you did the math and you said, well, if you reduce the price, how far down does it have to go so that people actually pay for the thing? And the market wasn't big enough that it really seemed to make sense for us, so we had to live with pirating.
You told me that there was about, when did you hit 1,000 subscribers?
Somewhere right in the beginning of the second year.
He's a resource, I gather, for you, information, you knew it was there. Go ahead, Paul.
It was an in-depth resource, because before this in the newspaper industry, there was the trade association publication. My mind's blank right now. Help me.
TCA, is that the one you?
No.
No?
Anyway, they had a production section, but it was highly influenced by the advertising. And Jonathan and John would publish 16 pages on a system, so they'd go through the justification H&J algorithms and basically say how they worked, and I would eat that stuff up because it was the authoritative source. Nobody else was doing the in-depth analysis of these systems and how they were constructed, what the technology was, how much memory they had, how the H&J algorithm worked or didn't work. So that was what editor and publisher.
That's an important point. When I meant editorial, that's what I was talking about. You were doing analysis work. You were doing in-depth work. It wasn't just news.
We had the main article in the front, and we had the news stuff in the back, but news was never just clipping press releases. Typical newsletter thing. You clip I had done something like that for 6 months before we did this, where you just sort of parrot a press release. The news was always trying to put something in context. So it was a little bit of analysis in the news as well. There was a lot of editorial content in that, but the main articles were probably exhaustively in depth.
Who did that research on those, that did the analysis work?
We did.
Who's we?
My father and I. We did 20 issues a year, and I probably wrote articles. In the beginning, I was probably writing 13 of those.
It's a hell of a lot of work.
Yeah.
Let me go ahead. In the 70s, then, do you have any of these seminars don't start in the 70s? Is that
We
correct?
did these tutorial things. Okay.
What's a tutorial?
That was basically, it was a class. People would come in for 2 days to have us tell them what was happening, go through, go through everything was happening, and you'd have a lot of interaction with the people as well. My favorite people were the people who'd show up from an unnamed government agency.
Okay, again, I'll ask the question, how many of you attended any of the tutorials? None of you. So I'm trying to get to the point where it effectively becomes this common denominator where you're starting to see.
Okay, this comes in by 1980. I had realized that we had now, all the newspapers that was happening in the 70s, you'd go to the ANPA show to see the new newspaper systems, you'd read the Sebold report, but by the 1980s, as we begin to get this new dawn of new technology coming, it was clear things were going to explode. So I had always valued being able to meet with people and exchange ideas, and I just figured, well, the thing to do now, we really need now, is to have a gathering for the people who are leading the industry so we can all talk about this stuff and exchange ideas. And so that's where the idea for starting Seybold Seminars came from. And we did the first one in February of 1981 in Los Angeles. And relatively quickly, people came, we exchanged ideas, it was great fun, and the thing that made me realize that this was really useful was the level of engagement that took place outside of the sessions. Okay, the break stuff, people talking well into the evening, and these were week-long things, and they were very intense. Then we added in, almost immediately, we started adding demo room. People wanted to show off the new stuff, and that just kept growing and growing and growing.
Stop again. How many of you eventually went to the seminars?
Our first one was I believe was in 83 in Los Angeles. And it was fairly small. I mean, it wasn't gigantic
Right, yeah.
thing.
And then John talked in '84.
Let me go around the room. Chuck?
I think I went to the second one. It was in February '82, maybe. I'd written an article for the Sebolds. I was aware of them in the late 70s, but I couldn't afford to subscribe. But then John's sister, Patty Sebold, introduced me to her father and Jonathan, and I wrote an article for them in August, I think, of '81. And then I attended the seminar in '82. But that article, I was astonished. I was a teacher at the Rhode Island School of Design, and I wrote articles for specialized magazines about fine printing and typography. And this article came out. I was getting calls from people and letters, and friends who were in the newspaper business, the sons of friends of my father, were calling and say, "You've hit the big time, you know, the Sebold report on typesetting." So it was electrifying, and I think in 1980 I came to I don't know whether you called it a tutorial or a seminar, but it was at Stanford, and there Donald Knuth showed off the text system, which I mentioned yesterday. And I met Don Knuth, which turned into a very fruitful and congenial relationship that wound up taking me to Stanford. So in 1980, 81, it really seemed to explode into the world of digital typography.
Well, how about yourself?
I was a poor college graduate student at the University of Minnesota, so it was a big deal subscribing to the Siebel report because I had to write a check for it out of my own bank account, which wasn't very big, like a couple $1,000. So, but I didn't go to the first seminar because I couldn't afford to go to it, but I started subscribing with the Volume 1, Issue 1. I probably went to the third one, I would suspect, with Minneapolis Star and Tribune paying my way.
But you, Liz?
I think I might have been at the first or second. I know I spoke about bitmap fonts at probably your second conference. I was one of the speakers, so.
Donald?
Yeah, I know Chuck's memory seems to be better than mine. I thought I met Chuck through Fine Print magazine in San Francisco, but my memory, I think John and Jonathan came to see the strange project that we had at Stanford. I sort of remember him coming to my office, but I don't remember it. And I saw some kind of a write-up in the Sebold newsletter, but I don't remember any more than that anymore.
Martin, any connection? Lee?
Yeah, the first public showing of Ventura Publisher was, I think it was either like December of '85 or the early part of '86. And the Beverly Hills Hilton, there was a Seybold Seminar with a breakout demo room and a kind of large format display. We had our little table. We drove down in our Dodge Caravan, and it was kind of like hitting the big time. Someone else kind of mentioned that we've been reading these reports for all these years about how these systems were being measured and judged, and now we were getting to actually show our package for the first time.
Hadn't been there before, you had?
I had not.
Chuck, John, when you were at Xerox Park.
We were at the Beverly Hilton one, certainly, but I think as soon as we founded Adobe, we started going.
Well, I never went to any of these seminars, and I think the reason is, in the 70s, there was basically, to my knowledge, no significant intersection between this kind of stuff we were doing at Park and the newspaper, mostly newspaper-focused publishing that Jonathan was concentrating on at the time. I think the first intersection came as a result of common interest in typography. And then it wasn't until the Mac came out and products like
PageMaker came into existence, that people in my world started taking a serious interest in this, because now that it was very clear that the two worlds were merging. But that was just not true before the Mac came out.
Before I forget, was there enough technological content in those, or was it mostly business content? What was the content, from your point of view, at those sessions?
Both.
Both. Okay. Bob?
I never attended any.
Man of good judgment, obviously. Dave, Dave Walden? Not at all. John?
I did not. We had, it's interesting, we had more of a computer-centric, exposure. So the original Xerox network servers prior to the 8010 were launched at the NCC in McCormick Place in Chicago. And if we wanted a place to go spend a week to go rub shoulders, we went to, the PC forum that Ben Rosen and Esther Dyson did. Was a sort of more likely place with a broader sort of, universe, although we were certainly aware of the Siebel conferences. It's not where I would go.
On Skull?
Yeah, went pretty religiously from once I got involved, which was in May of '85. So from then, for the next 3.5 years, went to pretty much every one down in LA, or later when he did, we helped with getting a desktop publishing conference. We were kind of the anchor tenant to help make sure stuff like that happened. So it was a big deal. So we were very supportive.
Were there people earlier at Apple who might have gone beside you?
I don't know
I was thinking about Bruce Blumberg, for
Yeah,
example.
I don't know. I don't think so. If either Barbara or Culkin or Bruce Blumberg went down, or Susan Kerr, I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I think it was, you got to understand, even with the laser writer, publishing was nothing. It was not any part of the psyche. It was all about a shared, really cool printer that made Steve happy, that could get the graphics and fonts onto on paper. So it was the Mac office, was the whole mentality.
I think I'm going to ask you later.
We'll get into, how that shifted later,
The
but
first,
it was.
the first Apple people who showed up were these two ladies who'd been out on the road. I'm trying to think of the first one's name. Second one was Katie Cadogan. And they, I'd never seen them before, and they just showed up sort of bedraggled. And they were the first Apple people to ever show up at a Sebold conference, I think.
It's interesting.
We knew Patty Siebel, since she was more marketing automation, which was closer to something I think Apple people could kind of relate to, besides our creative service guys and our ad agencies. But so we knew Patty, but we didn't know the other side of the Siebel family.
Paul, comment.
I have a question for Jonathan. Did you
Speak to this thing.
In the report, did you run an article on the Alto system back in the late 70s?
That was all non-disclosure.
So you never.
The first time I could write about what was happening at Park was when Star was introduced, and we had a practice of trying to do things like that on the day something was introduced, because we had the information beforehand, and like the Mac, the first publication that had anything about the Mac was the Sebold report that was actually put out. They had the ad on Super Bowl Sunday or something, and we were already in the mail. Okay, because Steve had given me a prototype Mac back in the fall previously, and I had written the article and done everything before that. When we wrote articles, didn't do this for the news. We did this. We would check on the news if we were dubious about something. But articles always got sent back to the people we were writing the system about, the article about, to check for accuracy, and for them to raise their objections then. We didn't guarantee we would publish what they wanted, but we wanted their feedback. So there was a loop in terms of time involved with that we had to have. So these things would have been, to be on deadline for that meant it would have been prepared some weeks before that.
Larry?
I don't remember attending anything or subscribing on a regular basis to anything. But if somebody said, actually you were a speaker in 1985 or something, maybe I was, but I don't remember anything like that.
before I forget with Apple, one of the things that's always fascinated me was that Apple was so successful because of an application, the Apple II, with the spreadsheet, with the VisiCalc. And yet he's saying, hey, we weren't thinking about the uses of the thing entirely. It's just a different headset. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. You were a marketing guy. You should have been thinking in those terms.
Of course they were thinking about the uses, but...
Pardon me?
Of course they were thinking about the uses, but it was uses in a different space. I mean, what do you think all those paint
We'll
and...
talk all about
paint
that.
and
There's a
Word
lot
and-
going on.
We'll discuss that later.
And Excel and all those things were uses.
There's a complex, where it's fond of saying that you can't know the adjacent possible, and I don't agree with him. I think you can know the adjacent possible. But what he's saying basically is that it's really hard for someone doing technology, for example, to anticipate how people are going to use that technology and what's going to happen with it. And this happens over and over and over again.
Incidentally, I meant to mention, there's only 5 speakers that can be live, mics can be live on the speaker system at any one time. Because just then he wasn't on the speaker. He's being recorded because there were 5 other mics that were already live. Isn't that strange? You guys got to fix that someday. Come on.
I think there's a huge market opportunity for a decent AV system. You could just clean up. For some reason, nobody wants to do it. Hear that, John?
Invest money, John. What the heck? Let's keep going, Jonathan. In terms of your time, the seminars are now run twice a year. You started to run them, or once a year? What were you doing?
We started once a year in '81, and then we did the desktop one, which became Sebold San Francisco, started in '86. So that's twice a year, 2 a year, and then I started Digital World, which was my real pet one, in 1990. And that was once a year also. By that time it was 3 a year then.
So tell me what kind of attendance you would have at one of the seminars.
It kept going up. So it was hundreds, and then it grew into thousands, and when it came into thousands in the seminar, okay, when it was get to like 2,000, I mean, it was hundreds, then 1,000, and 1,200, then 2,000. And what we did was, as it got bigger and bigger, we would break things into multiple tracks and multiple sessions that were more focused. The other thing we did from the very beginning was we did a real effort to host and provide housing for and facilities for all kinds of special interest groups. So we hosted stuff for the SGML people. We hosted stuff for the people working on color space. So all the people who are working on problems, since they were all going to be there anyway, that we tried to make sure that they would have their own space and their own place and so forth to have their own discussions.
You mentioned earlier that you would bring in vendors that they could get space there that would pay for that?
Initially, it was just demo space. It was just for demoing things for the people who were coming. And then basically it morphed into a trade show. The first thing we did from scratch that was meant to be a trade show was the desktop publishing when we started in 1986 in San Francisco. And that was designed, at that point, we knew we were in the trade show business, so we were just blatant about that. This is a trade show. So you had a conference and a trade show that ran concurrently. So you ended up by 93 in San Francisco, we were up to somewhere 2,000 people at the conference and about 40,000 at the trade show. So there was a...
Sorry?
40,000 at the trade show. That was...
It's usually the way these things go. I mean,
What?
SIGGRAPH is the same way.
Yeah. Okay, but for the contrast, the Boston, we'd moved the spring one to Boston by that time, to one East Coast and one West Coast. That was more of a high-end focus. That was more 17,000 people at the trade show. Okay.
7 or 7-0?
17,000. So because that was more the high-end stuff, and that was a smaller market. Okay. The bigger market was the West Coast one did focus more on the desktop stuff. That was a much bigger market by that time.
Who would come?
the people would come would be all these people who wanted to publish. I mean, this is the thing that surprised everybody. There was publishing is actually a very large industry. But all the things that counted publishing counted professional publishing. Nobody was counting all the organizations that publish. And there were more of them than there were the people in the professional field.
So the buyers that come to the trade show were people who were doing publishing,
People come to the
who were
trade show,
buying.
people who were buying the stuff, which is why people came to show at the trade show. Now, the other thing, the other piece of this is that we did two other things that were really, really important. Because trade shows, when you have new technology, trade shows are the place that people go to show off new technology to potential customers. So it's where you want to introduce products, which means that we worked really, really hard with we work with the press all the time. We had two PR ladies who sat right in the midst of the group in Malibu where the content people were. And their full-time job was deal with the press. I mean, deal with the press means someone calls up and says, I'm running a story about such and such, and we would tell them who to contact, who's, we have in the background information, tell them who to contact, who to talk to. If they needed stuff from one of us, they talked to one of us about it as well, but Beth and Robbie handled most of that stuff. When we got to a trade show, they would train the people from the companies who were novices at this how to do a press conference, how to do things. They would tell the press people what the press conferences were, what the schedule was, who was showing what.
Let me separate two things, because that's, from your standpoint, the trade show becomes a marketing vehicle, is that correct, for all of you who have products? The conferences, though, whatever you want to call them by that point in time, are a chance for you all to get together, exchange information, learn what's going on a technological basis. Is that a fair summary of the differences?
Just technology and business.
Yes. Speak for it.
There's as a attended at some of the early seminars and also eventually contributing to and getting stuff from the Sebold report, one of the interesting things is that people took it seriously. It was a trustworthy publication because so many of the other publications were either press releases assembled or opinion or hyperbole, but the Sebold report and at the seminars, I remember Jonathan pinning someone down after a talk and asking really clear questions about the implications, about the facts of the matter, and not putting people on the spot in an embarrassing way, but eliciting further information so that the audiences could actually judge beyond the presentation to what it implied. And the report was the same. They were very trustworthy documents. I'm sure that you had agendas and goals and so forth, but more than any other of those high-tech publications, the Sebold ones seemed like they were thoughtful and fair.
We will never forget the Seybold Seminar of 1989.
Tell us why, John.
What?
Tell us why.
That's when Apple and Microsoft made war on us. And
On record as saying I had left Apple at that time, and I was off being CEO of another company.
But just as an aside, in the package that we're giving here, Jonathan wrote a remembrance of the war or feud or whatever it was. So
Was that what
Yep.
Jonathan, I think, called it the Font Wars?
Font Wars. Anyway, we have that. At the end of the meeting, you'll all get a copy of his views of that. But that was one of the things I was trying to get at. With these meetings, there's 2,000 people. It's a lot of people, 1,500. Are these collegial? Are they educational?
that one wasn't.
Just to add something to it, and this is not negative, but there's nothing that the organizer of a conference likes more than to have a huge controversy like this, because it gets everybody engaged and involved. And so Jonathan's group put together a extra session on the last day, and it was a panel discussing, would you rather have Apple and Microsoft take over this industry, or would you rather stay with Adobe? And the person who chaired the panel, whose name I don't remember anymore, at the beginning said, I'd like to do a straw poll. And I would like everyone in the audience who would like Apple and Microsoft to get rid of Adobe for us to raise your hand. Now, there were a few Apple and Microsoft employees in the audience, so maybe 20 hands went up. But nobody else raised their hand. And the reason is, they knew what we were like to deal as a company. They knew where we were in terms of moving technology forward. And they simply didn't trust that Apple and Microsoft would be able to do what they needed.
This was.
Which indeed they wouldn't have been able to.
Yeah, but Apple, this was long after Steve had gone. Okay, and so we were dealing with John Louis Gasset, and we were dealing with, who was John Scully?
Scully.
Come forward.
John Scully and John Louis Gasset, and Apple was a different company.
And John Skull wasn't there.
John Skull wasn't there, but it was a turning point in the sense that this was the two largest PC providers were really leveling their guns.
It's a fascinating thing
See,
because...
the part of the thing here was that I knew that Microsoft was going to make the announcement at that conference. They had been working for a year building up to that, and I'd been trying to guide them to choose good fonts rather than bad fonts. I did not know until shortly before this that they had made this last-minute deal with Apple. But I couldn't hint to Adobe anything was happening, except to say to John that Microsoft was going to make an announcement, right, just before.
Well, you had talked to Bill Gates before,
Right.
so.
I got a phone call at home telling me that
And
that's what they were going to do.
it was, it needed a very serious technical response, and we did that.
How many days did the typical conference run?
5.
How many?
5 is a week.
And you would devote that kind of time to it?
Oh, yeah.
Lee?
You had, in contrast to the font wars, it actually was a pretty collegial experience, at least in most of the time for me. I got a chance to meet Paul there and different ones, and Jeremy Jake and Ted Johnson, who are key developers that were working on the Mac and Windows versions. So we got to know each other as they were the lead developers on PageMaker and we were the ones on Ventura. So you definitely got a chance to interact with people who understood the same set of problems that you were trying to solve, and it was, I really enjoyed them.
Let me stop for a minute, because one of the things, I was very involved in the trade association called ADAPSO that became ITAA, and most of the software companies. We never had those kinds of numbers there, and we never ran a trade show. But with 2,000 people, how do you become collegial?
Well, you know the top products and who the key developers are behind those, at least, so it's pretty easy to find those people. So.
See, if you look at the population, you've got users there, you've got newspapers there, you've got book people there, you've got people all different sorts of things. You've got people doing color stuff, you've got people doing tech documentation stuff, you've got people developing systems for this and people developing systems for that. So it's not that it's a big group and they've got interests in common and you do some things in common, but there is a lot of stuff going on and a lot of different sort of sub-communities within that. And that's what, that's where the collegial stuff is.
John, did you have a comment?
Well, just, John talked earlier about, the personal computer industry. The whole technology industry, events have played an incredible role, right? And so it's a forcing mechanism for product shipping. It was a place for sales, marketing, product, competitors, analysts, all the PR. You got a chance in 3 or 4 days, because most of us didn't stay 5, but some may have. But you would be there, you'd get a chance to meet everybody that you might not see, but you wanted to at least see them twice a year, and if you could see them more, the key people you saw more frequently. But you got a chance to see everybody, got really good feedback. It helped you go back, energized about what either had to be done or what was working, and so it's terrifically profound to new introductions of anything new. You need to have the kind of the tribe come together, even though there might be some arguing, but the tribe come together and then move on, and then you set another stake for another major thing to do. So Jonathan's in our world here was one of the real, galvanizing kind of events that was needed.
Jonathan, quick question. Was the trade show run concurrently, or was that run at a separate time?
The trade show overlapped with the seminar, okay? So the trade show was shorter. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, the trade shows don't run for that length of time. The seminars did because there was a lot to cover.
You had a lot of subgroups then.
Yeah.
Let me ask the people who were there and participating, why did you go, besides from a selling standpoint? What were you getting out of the communication there?
You saw the new products. You saw everybody and what they were trying to build, and how they were trying to use our products, for instance, how they were trying to use PostScript. So, I mean, and Steve Next was there, because Steve had started Next, and actually during the font wars, Jonathan had the good taste to bring Steve on the stage, and Steve was very positive which side he was on. So it was, but you got to see all of the new glimmers of light of new products and new ideas about how to use technology. And that's what you did.
And in addition to seeing both your competition, we also saw all of our business partners. I mean, we were developing printers for dozens of companies by this time, and they all came to the same conference, and we wanted to make sure that community continued to listen to us and understand why what we were providing for them was so critical.
That time we had about 35 OEMs who were producing printers.
So they were there, the OEMs?
Yes, oh, absolutely.
Paul?
Just add, I ditto all of this. Mostly the customers were particularly important to me. I would spend hours learning from our customers as to what their needs were in the product. But the thing that Jonathan hasn't touched upon was the international component of this as well. The 1,000 copies down in Australia wasn't an abbreviation. That went all over Europe. There was a whole contingent that came in. Jonathan, you might comment on that, because...
I mean, from the first of all, the Sebold report circulation was always 25% outside the U.S. From the first months, even though it was produced by a U.S. association. We did stuff overseas. We had a lot of overseas people come. And we got to the point in San Francisco where for several years we ran concurrent translation for Japanese. Because the Japanese, the Europeans and the Aussies and so forth were fine with English, but the Japanese had real problems with it. So there were enough Japanese there that we ran concurrent translation for the Japanese as well.
The reason I wanted to bring that up, because I think in yesterday's conversation regarding the technology, there was very little credence given to these other countries. And in fact, there were companies doing advanced work, and they had requirements that were very different, particularly Japanese and Chinese. And the size of the publishing industries, professional publishing in those countries, was huge and very important to their economic.
We had correspondents in the major countries, so we were always reporting news from those countries. I mean, I'd spent part of my high school years in Europe. I'd gone to high school there. My parents had lived there for a couple of years. From the beginning, we were always international.
I'm sorry, just a minute. Lee was next. Do you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, that's fine.
Go ahead, Liz.
Well, I want to add to what John Scull was indicating. For me, it was very important and valuable to get the input from our customers. And, although we were there selling and showing off our technology, it was the input, the feedback that I took back that was extremely invaluable for our marketing efforts. And the same people would come every year. I'll never forget, there was a guy from the New York, I think it was the Wall Street Journal. He made a point of coming to see me every year to see what was happening, and I got his input.
1 second, Doc. Did you all have user groups?
Yes.
So that's an addition.
Well, at Adobe, we were the first ones to produce the colophon, which is a newsletter, and we did it with PostScript, and we circulated to a large distribution list, primarily of every business card I'd ever collected in my life.
But you had user meetings then in addition?
No, that was, it just went out to that subscription. It just went out to our subscribers.
That's in the, again.
The primary communication was through the Seybold Seminars.
See, that's what's different here. I'm trying to, just a second, Don. That's what's different. In the case of the other software companies, every single one of them had a user group. Whether it was IBM with their, it was Share and Guide and so forth, every other one had user groups. 500 people, 1,000.
We did for the applications. We didn't for PostScript. The applications, Illustrator, Photoshop, we had user
That you
groups.
did go with
Yes,
user groups.
Yes.
Lee, did you have a user group?
At least for Ventura, we didn't, there was a guy that was like an early enthusiast user of the product, and he created a magazine and a users group called Ventura Publisher Users Group. I forget his name, actually, but he was a great service to us because he built a whole following.
How about you, Paul?
Well, the SIGs that you're familiar with that developed all over the country, and they had application user groups for graphics and design and PageMaker, and we would go to those and present, but we didn't have any
Have
per
your own.
se.
Okay. Sorry, Don, you had some comment?
It's one a related question. That I was expecting to hear more about it before. So I think a lot of us remember that there was something called a typewriter. And in the 1970s, you know, a lot of people used typewriters, and a lot of things were produced on typewriters, and that doesn't happen anymore. You know, I might get 2 or 3 letters a year that that were on a typewriter because they had to write to me because I don't have email. Okay, so this is a huge change, and nowadays people use fonts instead of having just what they got on a typewriter, and in the 60s people could get a IBM Selectric, and they could change the ball, and they could have 2 styles or 3 styles of type. Okay, so in advance to the point where we're finally, the man on the street knows what a font is. Okay, so I just sort of like to focus on how this transition went on, because we saw the people who were using fonts and doing a lot of composition before 1980, mostly in newspapers, and also book publishers. I read that Herbert Hoover insisted on having his speeches typeset before he would proofread them, but this is very unusual. Somehow there was this change, and a lot of it took place to the 80s, 90s, but this must have been shown up in these Seybold Seminars, where you started out with people who didn't use H and J, but then other people started using it because it was available on their computers. So I just wanted to sort of bring that out as an important historical.
I want to illustrate that point. I got a phone call in the early days from a customer who said, "I love your product, I use it, but the only typeface I use is Courier, because if my newsletter doesn't look like it was produced very quickly, people won't read it." And so it had to look like it came off a typewriter.
That's interesting.
One other point. So when we built the laser writer the code had to be put into masked ROM. In other words, you put it in once and you can't debug it. Okay, no bugs. So it was a 0.5 megabyte of masked ROM. But all of the machinery for all of the languages were in that masked ROM, even though there were no fonts. So all the Japanese machinery was in there, all of the backward writing and up and down writing and all of the spacing characteristics
They're all in that.
were anticipated in the original laser writer.
Wow, unbelievable. I want to go one last thing to talk about on the thing. Talk about your finances. How profitable were the meetings? How profitable were the trade shows? Did you become a very wealthy man? We'd like to hear about this, Jonathan.
Because this was evangelical, basically on publications side, as that grew, all the resources went back into the product. So we would add people, we'd add staff people, we'd make the product better. So publications was, you know, it made money to cover its expenses. As I said, I never took more out than I put into it. I mean, when we're doing the conferences, when we're doing the seminars in the 70s, all of the money we were paid for that went into publications, and I took out less in salary than what I was putting in. So that was always viewed as being an evangelical kind of thing, and we supported ourselves with consulting initially. The seminars, the trade shows in particular is a very interesting business because you have a very high fixed cost to get the thing off the ground. And if you don't make the fixed cost, you're in deep trouble. And once you go past that, then you become very profitable.
So, did you?
Yes, yes, but not from not from the scope of what these guys were. I mean, the value of our company was a rounding error compared to the value of these guys' companies.
Let me go with that. You eventually sold the company?
To Ziff Davis, yeah.
1990?
1990.
And was that a profitable venture for you?
Yes, it was profitable. I had done profit sharing from the beginning in the company, in Seybold Seminars in particular, and so it was profitable for me. It was profitable for the employees because they all got a share in that too. So they got, about half of that went to the employees.
You don't have to answer this question, but it'll be asked of each of the companies as we talk. Are you willing to tell us how much you sold it for? You don't have to. It's not a requirement.
I'm not sure I want that on the historical record. I just feel odd
Do
about
it.
that. Okay, but I will say that it was, as I say, it was a rounding error in the values that the software companies went for.
You might or might not consider it a rounding error. I don't know. We'll have to think about that. It's one of those things, though, that the numbers changed of what people were paying for companies so dramatically by the time you got to the 90s. I know that I was doing merger and acquisition work with a lot of software companies, and originally, if we could get to $1 million on selling the company, we thought we did well. And then if you couldn't get 10 million, and then finally you had to have a bunch more zeros. You were at the 100 million, and now you talk billions of dollars for some of the companies. It just changed so unbelievably during that period of time.
There's not that many zeros.
Anyway, unless there's one other question, we're going to break this session and start with the next. Go ahead, Butler.
It occurs to me for the historians that it might be very interesting to compare the evolution and structure of the Sebold Seminars with the standard conference and trade show for interactive graphics, which is SIGGRAPH, which had very different origins, was not inspired by the same sort of concentrated evangelistic spirit that got you going. But I think there are also a lot of similarities. The trade show grew to attract 50 or 60,000 people.
This is SIGGRAPH. Talk about it. Go ahead.
Yeah. Bob can talk about SIGGRAPH.
Bob, go ahead.
Well, it's just, I was thinking as you went around the room asking who had gone to Sebold seminars. I had not, but I was a SIGGRAPH baby. In fact, had withdrawal when I stopped going. And because the interactive graphics world grew up in that way, and their activities, for example, were things like standards for device-independent graphics packages and so on. And then when the entertainment industry, when the people like at Utah figured out how to do realistic imagery, suddenly that became where all the people like Pixar and so forth started to gravitate. The conferences increasingly turned to fancy rendering rather than interaction or systems around graphics. That was sort of became a settled topic, or a set of settled topics. And today it's primarily for the media and entertainment, synthetic graphics, synthetic imagery folks.
It's an interesting thing. I
I say one more thing, just that give you a picture of how, what you're dealing with the nascent industry, was, one of the things we found was that most of the companies we were dealing with, the people who were running marketing and things of this sort, were young and totally inexperienced. And so the people who ran our trade show started what they called Camp Sebold. And they would have these people in before the show to train them on what they were, on how to do what they were supposed to do, because they didn't know.
It's terrific.
I mean, this was, everybody was sort of making up as they went along.
Tom, you had a question?
Yeah, so just following up on that on the business model side. So looking at the history of computing more generally, Dick Canning's EDP Analyzer was a pioneer in a kind of user and application tech-savvy focused model. I was wondering, were you familiar with that or with any other successful newsletter-based businesses in other areas that you tried to emulate the business model of, or from your viewpoint, was it something you were making yourself?
I don't. I mean, I'd seen other newsletters and so forth. I'm not aware of anyone who was doing what we were doing, how we were trying to do it. We're not copying anybody else. We were doing what we thought was appropriate for our particular situation.
Not even in
You
other
had a
industries?
monopoly. You had a monopoly.
Just
in your
one at a
space.
time.
Yeah. Jonathan had a monopoly in his space.
Liz?
There were clones of Jonathan's work, portions of it. For example, the Jeffy Report was an example of somebody who, quote, I think appreciated what Jonathan was trying to do in producing an accurate, technically astute evaluation of what was going on in the market. And I think Perry Jeffy tried to do that. Now, his circulation of his report was much smaller, and it was aimed toward more the graphic arts industry. But there were people that cloned some of the things John did. They just didn't pull it off like he did.
I want to say one other thing here that I feel very strongly about.
Yeah.
Nobody who worked for us was allowed to have any financial interest in any company remotely that we covered, remotely related. We also were very careful about you can't, I mean, you can be friends with people, but you can't be too intimate with people because you can't build favoritism. And my brief exposure to the press in general and the newsletter business in general was that was not true generally. And I never understood how you could be objective if you didn't do that, okay? Because I just knew too many people who had to be compromised by what they were doing.
Yes, John, and this is in the
Well, I don't know, you're just asking others. Coming out of the personal computer industry, we were actually quite used to there being a person like Jonathan. We had Ben Rosen, who did it first, and he had a newsletter, very thoughtful, very impartial. He had a gathering, kind of everyone would go to Mecca, once a year. Then Stuart Alsop did the same, kind of continued it. So we were kind of used to that. So it felt very comfortable when, we got into this new world, and there was, our Ben Rosen, if you think of it that way, our Stuart Alsop, very, very evangelical, really bought into it, brought people together, and was bipartisan, which was really great, so.
And that's an excellent, just,
Were the two closest analogies.
Yeah, yeah.
But they didn't do the in-depth analysis, but they did a lot of the other stuff.
They did the other, which was great.
the point is, though, that in so many of these application areas, yours is a good example, but you're raising some of the others, there was always seemed to be an evangelist, someone who brought the message and helped to bring the people together. End of this session.